In the quiet town of Larkspur, nestled between the mountains and the desert, a drifter's life was the only one most new. But when a gang of drifters chooses to harass a calm, solitary farmer named Jacob Cross, they have no idea who they're truly messing with. Jacob isn't just a farmer. He's a legendary gunslinger who once rode with the most feared outlaws in the West. As the drifters escalate their torment, they discover too late the truth about the quiet man they thought was easy prey. What happens next will send a wave of terror through them, making them wish they'd never set foot on his land. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The land stretched out before Jacob crossed like an ocean of golden wheat, waving gently under the hot midday sun. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and growing crops, a peaceful tranquility that Jacob had come to appreciate over the years. His hands, weathered from years of work, moved slowly as he guided the plow through the rows, his steady movements a rhythm he knew well. He was content here, far from the chaos of towns and cities, far from the noise of men who didn't understand the value of hard work. Larkspur, a small town nestled on the outskirts of the prairie, was just far enough from the lawless fringes to avoid most trouble. It was the kind of place that people came to disappear, to leave the past behind. Jacob had come here years ago, looking to escape the remnants of a life that had been built on blood and violence. Here, he had found solace in the quiet simplicity of farming. But even in the solitude of the land, trouble had a way of finding him. Today, as he worked the land, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the wind carried a warning, a whisper of something bad on the horizon. He had lived long enough to know that peace didn't last forever. He had made his peace with it, learned to embrace it, but that didn't mean he was blind to the world around him. From the corner of his eye, Jacob saw movement, a small cloud of dust on the road leading into town. He paused, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, his eyes narrowing as he watched the figures approach. 3 men on horseback. They were drifters. He could tell by the way they rode, the slouch in their posture, the dust that clung to their worn clothes. These weren't the kind of men who came through town on a mission of good. Jacob had lived long enough to know trouble when he saw it, and this was trouble. It wasn't the first time drifters had passed through Larkspur, but it was the first time in a long while that Jacob had seen them linger. His fingers tightened on the plow handle, instinct telling him that these men weren't just passing through. They were looking for something, or someone. The men dismounted at the edge of his farm, their horses snorting as they stood still, their eyes scanning the land. Jacob stood tall, wiping his brow once more before walking toward them slowly. His gait was deliberate, not hurried, just calm, like a man who had seen enough of the world to know when to walk away and when to stand his ground. "Afternoon," Jacob said, his voice steady and calm as he approached the trio of drifters. They all turned to face him, sizing him up as if they were hunting wolves and he was their prey. "Afternoon, farmer," one of them said, his voice dripping with condescension. The man was tall, broad-shouldered with a scar that ran down the left side of his face. His 2 companions stood behind him, both looking like they hadn't seen a bath in months. "Name's Jacob Cross," he said, his voice flat, offering no extra information. The man with the scar grinned, his teeth yellow and crooked. "Cross? Huh? Never heard of you. But I reckon a man like you could use a bit of company. Looks mighty lonely out here." He took a step toward Jacob, his boots kicking up dust. The 2 men behind him remained still, watching, waiting. Jacob didn't flinch. "I don't need company." The drifter laughed, a rough, wheezing sound. "Don't need company, huh? Well, we thought we'd make sure. See, we're low on supplies, and a man like you has got a nice piece of land. Ain't no harm in asking for a little something, is there?" Jacob's gaze hardened, his hands at his sides, relaxed but ready. "You're not welcome here. Best move along." The man with the scar cocked his head, eyeing Jacob up and down. "What's this? You're turning us away? Ain't you ever heard of hospitality?" He reached for the handle of his revolver, his fingers brushing the leather. "I think it's time to make you a little more welcoming." Jacob took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the man. "I'm not interested in trouble," he said slowly, his voice calm. But the warning was clear. "You're outnumbered. You better leave." The drifter's smirk faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm afraid of you, old man?" he sneered, drawing his revolver and pointing it directly at Jacob's chest. "This farm looks like it could use a new owner, and we're just the men to take it." Jacob didn't move. His eyes locked on the drifter's revolver, and for a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. The world around him felt still, and his pulse slowed. The breeze that had been blowing across the fields had gone silent. He had spent years burying the past, trying to forget who he had been. But the truth was, Jacob Cross had never truly left the life of a gunslinger behind. It had always been there, lying dormant, waiting for the moment when he would be forced to draw again. The drifter's hand twitched, but before he could make another move, Jacob's hand was already reaching for his own revolver, smooth and practiced. The draw was quick, faster than the drifter could ever anticipate. In a single motion, Jacob's shot rang out, the bullet finding its mark in the drifter's hand, knocking the revolver to the dirt. The other two men froze, their hands hovering over their weapons, but not daring to pull them. "Now," Jacob said, his voice low and controlled, "I suggest you take your horses and leave. And you don't come back." The drifter with the scar gritted his teeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. But he didn't reach for another gun. Instead, he looked at his companions, who had yet to draw their weapons. "We'll let you go this time, farmer," he muttered, spitting on the ground. "But you better remember, there's always someone looking to take what's yours." Jacob's eyes never left him, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he holstered his revolver. "And the next time you come around here, I won't be so forgiving." The drifter didn't say another word. He grabbed his horse, pulling himself into the saddle. His companions followed suit, and with one last glare at Jacob, they spurred their horses and rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust in their wake. Jacob stood still, watching them disappear into the distance. The land had grown quiet again, the tension of the encounter fading as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. He could feel the weight of his past resting on his shoulders, but he didn't let it consume him. He had made his choice, and this farm, this life, was the one he had chosen to protect. But as the drifters faded from view, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Jacob Cross stood in the fading light, his gaze lingering on the horizon where the drifters had disappeared. His hand rested on the handle of his plow, though his mind was far from the farm work he had been doing before the men had arrived. The quiet that settled in the air around him was deceiving. He knew trouble was never too far away in a place like this. The drifters had been a test, but he had no doubt more would come, testing his resolve, testing his quiet life. Jacob had hoped the past could remain buried, that the land could be enough to keep him hidden, far away from the chaos he had once been part of. But he knew deep down that he was never truly free from it. A man like him didn't just walk away from the things he'd done, the people he'd killed, without leaving something behind. It followed him, just waiting for the moment when he was pulled back into the fight. As he walked toward the barn to check on his animals, the weight of the old revolver in its holster seemed heavier than usual. The quiet, peaceful life he had built felt more fragile now, something that could be shattered at any moment. The drifters had warned him, and Jacob knew that when they returned, they would come harder, bringing more men, more force. He entered the barn and began checking the tools, his fingers running over the worn handles of the axes, the ropes, the farming equipment. All of it was well kept, a symbol of the life he had chosen after he had left the blood-soaked past behind him. The smell of hay and leather filled the space, the horses nuzzling against the stalls, content and calm. But Jacob wasn't. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment when the drifter had drawn on him, and the quickness with which he had responded. It had been too easy. The kind of easy that made him wonder how many times he had drawn his gun in his past life. Too many to count. He had killed so many, he'd lost count of the faces, the names. The silence in the barn felt stifling, and Jacob walked out into the open air, needing to breathe. His eyes scanned the rolling hills that stretched out before him. There were no signs of movement, no sign of any more drifters. but he could feel the tension in his bones. They'd be back. He had no doubt of that. He had heard rumors, of course. Every man in the West had a past, and there were whispers about the quiet man with the scars of an outlaw. He had been known once, known as one of the fastest guns in the West, known for the cold efficiency of his aim. But those days were behind him. Jacob Cross had buried the man he used to be, the man who rode with ruthless outlaws, who fought for nothing but survival and gold. He had left that man behind when he came to this farm. But the West was always hungry for a fight. It demanded blood. It demanded men like him. And if these drifters were any indication, the hunger for violence was far from satisfied. As the sun began to set, Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively brushing the revolver at his side. It was a small group this time, only 2 riders. They approached slowly, carefully, as if unsure whether they should continue forward. But Jacob knew they were coming for him. They had to be. He stood tall, watching them draw nearer. The first rider was tall, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The second was smaller, but the way he sat on his horse, the easy hand on his rifle, made Jacob wary. They weren't drifters this time. These men had the air of someone with purpose. The first rider stopped about 10 paces from Jacob, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the lone farmer standing firm in front of his home. The second rider sat silently, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Afternoon," the first rider called out, his voice low but carrying a threat. Jacob didn't move. "Afternoon. You Jacob Cross?" The man asked it casually, as if he were asking for directions to town. But there was an edge to his voice, a question laced with tension. "That's my name," Jacob said simply. The rider seemed to consider this for a moment before tipping his hat slightly. "We've heard of you. Quiet fellow. Been around for a while. But see, we got a bit of business here, and we're wondering if you might want to settle things peacefully." Jacob's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. I don't know what business you think you have, but I suggest you get to it. And make it quick." The rider chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "We heard you used to be someone. Back in the day. They say you were one of the fastest gunmen in the West. The kind of man who could end a fight before it ever started." Jacob didn't respond. He didn't need to. The memories of that time flooded back like they always did. He had been known. He had made a name with his hands, with his gun, and with the bodies that fell at his feet. But he wasn't that man anymore. "We don't want no trouble," the rider continued, his voice now almost friendly. "We just heard there was a man who could take care of things around here, help a few people out. A man who isn't afraid to stand his ground." Jacob kept his eyes on the rider, waiting for the real purpose to be revealed. He knew this was a test. They weren't here for a peaceful conversation. They were here because they had heard stories. Stories that would lead them to his doorstep. "You come out here looking for trouble?" Jacob asked quietly, his voice steady. "You looking to make me prove something to you?" The rider's eyes hardened, and in that instant, Jacob knew what was coming. He saw the flash of the man's hand, reaching for his revolver, but it was already too late. Jacob moved faster than the rider could react, his hand a blur as his revolver was in his palm, aimed and fired in a single, fluid motion. The bullet hit the man square in the chest before he had even drawn his weapon. The rider's body slumped forward, and he fell from his horse without a sound. The second rider, startled, reached for his rifle, but Jacob was already moving again. He didn't need to think. The gun was already in his hand, the shot already fired, the second rider's body falling to the ground before he had even aimed his rifle. The 2 men lay on the dirt, motionless, as Jacob stood still, his breath steady. He had not drawn first, but he had drawn faster, and he would not hesitate again. The dust settled around him, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the fields. He holstered his revolver and turned back toward the farm. The moment had passed, but the next was already on its way. The wind swept across the land, a soft but constant reminder of the open, unforgiving world that lay just beyond the edges of Jacob's farm. The bodies of the 2 riders lay in the dirt, a grim testament to what had just transpired. Jacob Cross didn't flinch, didn't allow himself to feel the weight of what he had done. In his line of work, Men like him didn't get the luxury of reflection. His world was one where action spoke louder than words. For a moment, everything around him felt eerily still. The horses stood quietly, their hooves stirring the dust, and the sun slowly sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the farm. Jacob's fingers tightened around the reins of his horse, his gaze still fixed on the two drifters. He'd put them down fast, too fast, maybe, but he hadn't wanted to risk any more trouble. Never a quiet day, Jacob muttered to himself, turning back toward the barn. The two drifters had come looking for something: trouble, supplies, information, maybe even revenge. But they hadn't known who they were dealing with. Most people didn't. Jacob hadn't needed to kill them. He could have made them leave. He could have given them a warning, let them get back on their horses and ride off into the distance. But something inside him told him that letting them go would be a mistake. These men weren't here by accident. They'd heard the stories of a man who had once been one of the fastest guns in the West. A man whose reputation, much like his past, lingered in the air like a dark cloud. Jacob had left that life behind, but it had never truly left him. The sun was just setting as Jacob moved to the barn, the quiet weight of the revolver at his side a constant companion. He had cleaned it after each fight, each kill. It wasn't a weapon he wanted to keep, but it was the one he had, the one that had made him infamous. The door creaked open as Jacob entered the barn, the smell of hay and leather mixing with the scent of the evening air. His horses were restless, shifting in their stalls as if they too could sense the tension that had suddenly descended upon the farm. He needed to keep them calm, keep them ready. His mind raced as he thought about the drifters he'd just dealt with. They hadn't come alone. They wouldn't have. The next group would be bigger, stronger. Jacob's fingers brushed over the old saddle in the corner, a silent reminder of the life he had once led. He had ridden with men who would have burned down whole towns to get what they wanted. He had shot men just to prove he was faster, just to keep his place in the gang. But that life was behind him. He had found peace in the soil, in the land, in the simple rhythm of tending to his farm. But peace was fleeting in the West. Always. As Jacob moved back outside, he looked across the open plains toward Larkspur. He could feel the pull of the town, the sense that trouble was stirring there as well. It always did. He knew that Blackthorn's influence wasn't far behind. The drifters had been a warning, a test, but they wouldn't be the last. Blackthorn wouldn't let it go. His mind was sharp as he thought of the townspeople, folks who came here to disappear, to escape the noise of the world. They had nothing to do with his past, nothing to do with the chaos that had followed him here. Yet they would suffer because of it. But Jacob would protect them. He'd spent years protecting his own peace. He wouldn't let Blackthorn or anyone else take it from him now. The night was quiet, and Jacob sat on the porch, watching the stars as they began to emerge in the clear sky. He'd fought long enough to know that a man could only run from his past for so long. But when it came knocking, he would have to face it again. The sound of hooves broke the silence. Jacob didn't need to turn to know that more trouble was coming. This wasn't over. He stood, his hand sliding down the smooth barrel of his revolver. A deep breath filled his lungs as he made his way to the front of the house, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel. There, in the distance, a lone rider was approaching, a silhouette against the darkening sky. Jacob didn't flinch as the man drew nearer, his horse moving at a slow pace. The rider's figure grew clearer, a long coat flowing behind him, his hat low over his face. Another drifter, perhaps? A lone gunman, no doubt. The rider reined in his horse a few feet from Jacob, stopping with an air of confidence that Jacob had seen too many times before. "Nice farm you've got here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jacob studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. He could ask questions, try to figure out what this man wanted. But in his experience, men like this never came to talk. "You're not welcome," Jacob said quietly, his voice flat. The man didn't seem fazed by the bluntness. Instead, he swung down from his horse with a smooth, practiced motion. "Ain't about being welcome, farmer," he replied, drawing a long, jagged knife from his belt. "It's about taking what we want. And you, my friend, are going to help us get it?" Jacob's fingers twitched towards his revolver, his body ready to react. He knew what was coming next. I'm not interested in helping you, Jacob said. I suggest you leave or I'll make you leave. The drifter smirked, stepping closer. I don't think you'll do anything. I think you're just a washed-up old man who thinks he's a gunslinger. But you ain't, not anymore. You're just a farmer. Jacob's hand slid to the revolver with an ease that belied his years. The man's words hung in the air for a heartbeat, a challenge, a test. The drifter was closer now, too close. Jacob's finger twitched, and the revolver was in his hand, aimed and steady. The shot rang out, the sound sharp and final in the quiet night. The shot echoed through the still night, a sharp crack that seemed to freeze the world for a brief moment. The drifter's smirk disappeared as the bullet struck him square in the chest. His eyes widened in shock as he staggered backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the wound before he crumpled to the ground with a heavy thud. Jacob stood there, his revolver still aimed, his eyes locked on the fallen man. The dust settled around them, the only sound the wind rustling through the dry grass and the rhythmic thud of Jacob's heartbeat. The horse that had carried the drifter reared up, its hooves thundering in panic, but Jacob didn't flinch. He'd done this before. The man lay there, still as death, his knife forgotten on the ground beside him. Jacob lowered his revolver slowly, his eyes still focused on the body. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted to have to kill again, but he knew, deep down, that there was no other choice. These men weren't here for conversation. They weren't looking for peace. Jacob turned away from the body, his boots crunching on the dirt as he made his way back to the porch. He didn't need to check if the man was dead. He knew he was. The gun he carried was fast, deadly, and it never missed. Jacob had learned long ago that the only way to survive in a world like this was to shoot first and ask questions later. His mind was already working, the thoughts sharp and deliberate. This wasn't just a random drifter. No, this man had been sent. He was part of something bigger, part of the same group of drifters that had come after him days ago. They were getting bolder, and Jacob knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But what was it that they were after? Jacob's mind flashed back to the farm's quiet mornings, the days spent tending the crops and the animals. All of that peace now felt so fragile, so easily shattered. He had worked hard to build a life here, far from the violence of his past, but it was clear now that his past wasn't done with him. They had come for him once, and now they were coming again. He glanced back at the drifter's body, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting the land in long, shadowy hues. Jacob's fingers gripped the porch railing tightly as he stared out at the quiet horizon. If they were coming for him, then they were coming for more than just a quiet farmer. They were coming to settle old scores. Jacob turned toward the barn, moving with purpose. He needed to prepare. He needed to make sure that the next time they came, they wouldn't be able to take him by surprise. He grabbed his old saddlebag from the corner, the leather worn but still solid. The revolver he carried was a constant companion, but it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. A man like him needed more than just a gun. He needed the knowledge, the tools, and the plan to survive. As Jacob opened the barn doors, the smell of hay and leather filled his nostrils. He glanced over the tools he had laid out over the years. Rakes, pitchforks, axes, all well-maintained, all part of the life he had worked to build. But his eyes landed on the back corner, on the old chest he had kept locked away for so long. He hadn't needed to open it for years, but now it seemed the right time. The chest creaked as Jacob lifted the lid, the familiar weight of old memories hitting him like a wave. Inside were weapons. Not just any weapons, but the ones from his past. The ones he had used in those violent days when he had been a gunslinger. A man known for his deadly aim and the fear he instilled in anyone who dared cross him. There were rifles, pistols, and a long knife, all tools of his former trade. Jacob's fingers brushed the wood of the rifle, the barrel smooth and familiar beneath his hand. His eyes lingered on the weapons for a long moment, but he didn't reach for them just yet. Instead, he stood still, taking in the weight of it all. He had walked away from this life, buried it in the ground with his past. But the past had a way of coming back, and Jacob knew that if he was going to protect what he had built here, he would need every tool at his disposal. The sound of hooves reached his ears again, this time closer. Jacob's heart rate quickened as he turned toward the door. The drifters from before hadn't returned yet, but it wouldn't be long before someone else came along. Someone bigger. Someone ready to finish what they started. He grabbed the rifle and loaded it with a practiced hand. The action was fluid, automatic. This wasn't the first time he'd had to fight for his life. It wouldn't be the last. Outside, the sound of the approaching riders grew louder, echoing off the hills. This time, Jacob wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. He had made his decision. This time, he would make them pay. He stepped out of the barn, the cool evening air swirling around him. His boots hit the dirt with a soft thud as he walked toward the front of the house, his rifle held at his side. Jacob's fingers brushed the smooth stock, the weight of it reassuring. The riders came into view, 5 men this time. They weren't drifters like the last ones, but there was no mistaking the way they moved. They had the air of men who were used to getting what they wanted. They were the kind of men who didn't take no for an answer. Jacob stood still, his eyes scanning the group. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard, reined in his horse and looked Jacob over with a practiced eye. "Got a problem here, farmer?" the man called out, his voice smooth, too smooth. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle. This wasn't going to be like before. This wasn't going to be a simple exchange of words. These men were here for something, and Jacob wasn't going to let them take it. "You could say that," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "But the real problem is you." The man with the grizzled beard grinned, the sun glinting off his teeth as he dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of his own revolver. "Let's see if you're as quick as they say, old man." Jacob's hand shifted, the rifle ready in his arms, aimed and steady. He wasn't interested in threats. Not anymore. This time, he would end it before it even began. The air hung heavy between Jacob and the group of riders, the tension almost palpable. Jacob's grip on his rifle tightened, but he remained calm, his eyes never leaving the man with the grizzled beard. His heart beat steadily in his chest, each beat reminding him of the life he had left behind and the one he now had to defend. The rider's grin faltered slightly as he sized Jacob up, clearly not expecting the calm that radiated from the farmer. Jacob's reputation, though known in whispers, had earned him a kind of respect, one built on fear, and on the countless men who had underestimated him. The rider shifted his weight, his hand resting on his revolver, but not yet drawing. "You seem like a man who knows how to handle himself," the leader said, his voice dripping with a false civility. "We've heard about you, Jacob Cross, the farmer who used to be something more. A gunslinger. A killer." Jacob's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the words pressing in on him, the old reputation haunting him like a shadow. He hadn't wanted to be that man anymore. He had left that life behind. Left the blood, the violence, and the endless killing. But men like this didn't care about redemption. They didn't care about a man's past. They only saw what they wanted to take. "I'm a farmer now," Jacob said quietly, the words steady and controlled. "And that's the only thing that matters." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the fields. "A farmer? Huh? That's a real nice story. But I think you've got a lot more in you than just that. I've heard tales of how fast your hands were, how you'd kill a man before he could even blink. How many men did you kill to get that reputation?" Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. His past was buried deep, hidden beneath the soil of this land he had worked so hard to cultivate. But the man's words were a reminder that no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to forget, the past had a way of coming back. And when it didn't care how much a man had changed. The leader stepped closer, his horse's hooves kicking up dust. The other riders remained mounted, eyes flicking between Jacob and their leader. They were waiting for something, a sign, a move, a reason to draw their guns. But Jacob wasn't going to give them that reason. "You don't scare me, farmer," the leader said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've killed men twice your size, men who were faster than you could ever hope to be. I'd suggest you hand over what you've got, and we'll let you live. Maybe we'll even leave you your farm. But if you resist, well, you know what happens then." Jacob's pulse remained steady, his breathing calm. His fingers curled around the rifle's stock, the cold metal a familiar comfort in his hands. He knew how this ended. The man was trying to force him into submission, trying to get him to back down without drawing a single shot. But Jacob wasn't going to let it happen that way. Not again. "You want something from me?" Jacob said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Then you're going to have to take it." With that, Jacob moved in a blur of motion, drawing his rifle to his shoulder with the speed of a lightning strike. He didn't wait for the man to draw his revolver. He knew he wouldn't need to. The rifle was already aimed, already fired. The bullet hit the man square in the chest before he even had the chance to react. The leader's body jerked back, his mouth opening in a silent gasp as he crumpled to the ground. The horses reared in panic, their riders scattering, but Jacob didn't wait. He had no time for hesitation. The rifle stayed in his hands as he turned, quickly aiming and firing at the next rider, who had pulled his revolver with the intent to fire. The shot rang true, and the rider fell from his horse, the gun still clutched in his hand. The remaining 3 riders froze, their eyes wide with shock and fear. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected a man like Jacob to act so swiftly, so decisively. But that was what they had underestimated. Jacob Cross wasn't just a farmer. He was a man who had killed before, a man who knew how to protect what was his. "Leave. Now," Jacob said, his voice cold and low. "You've made your mistake. Don't make it worse." The riders hesitated, their eyes flicking from the bodies of their fallen comrades to Jacob, who stood in the center of it all, the rifle still steady in his hands. The leader, now dead, was proof enough of what Jacob was capable of. The remaining riders were not eager to meet the same fate. Finally, one of them, the youngest of the group, dropped his gun to the ground and dismounted. "We don't want any more trouble, mister," he said, his voice shaking. "We're just looking for supplies." "We didn't know." Jacob's eyes locked on him, and he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Pity. But there was no room for mercy. "Not now. You're lucky," Jacob said, his voice softer, but no less firm. "Get your horses, and get out of here, before I change my mind." The youngest rider nodded quickly, scrambling to mount his horse as the other 2 riders followed suit. They wasted no time in spurring their horses into motion, kicking up dust as they raced away from the farm. Jacob watched them ride off, his rifle still in his hands. The stillness of the evening returned, but it was different now. The land felt heavier, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had killed again. And for what? For his farm? For his peace? He lowered the rifle slowly, his fingers still tight around the stock. The man he used to be, he could feel him stirring inside. The gunslinger who had once been known across the West, feared by those who had heard his name. He hadn't wanted to go back to that life. He had tried to escape it, but it seemed the West wouldn't let him forget. Jacob stood there for a long time, his eyes fixed on the road where the riders had disappeared. The past had returned, and it wasn't going to let him go. The wind picked up, the soft rustling of the dry grasses carrying a sense of finality. Jacob stood alone in the growing shadows of dusk, his rifle still resting in his hands, the weight of the situation sinking deep into his bones. He hadn't wanted this. Not today. But the drifters had forced his hand, and now they would think twice before ever coming near his farm again. The West was unforgiving, and Jacob knew that. But there was a part of him that had hoped, just for once, to live quietly, without the bloodshed that had marked his past. His boots clicked softly on the dry earth as he moved toward the barn, each step heavy with the knowledge that this fight wasn't over. The drifters were gone for now, but they weren't the real threat. Jacob knew this was only the beginning. Word would spread about the man who could still shoot with the same deadly accuracy he once had. The man who had made his name known in the West, a name whispered among outlaws and lawmen alike. Jacob had hoped to bury that name, to let it fade into the past like the dust of the desert. But the past had a way of finding you, and he had learned long ago that no matter how far you ran, it was always waiting. As he stepped into the barn, the familiar scent of hay and leather filled his nostrils. His horses were restless, shifting in their stalls, their eyes wide and alert. Even they knew something was wrong. Jacob wasn't sure how much longer they could hide. The land might be quiet for now, but he could feel it in his gut. The storm was coming. He set the rifle down on a nearby workbench, his fingers brushing the worn wood of the handle. It had been years since he'd had to reach for it like this. Years since he'd had to remind himself of the old skills that had once kept him alive. He had spent so long convincing himself that the past was behind him, that he could move on, be something different. But it was always there, like a shadow following his every move, just waiting for the moment when it would emerge again. Jacob had always been a man who lived by his instincts. And right now, every instinct told him that this wasn't over. The drifters would return, maybe not tomorrow, but they would come back with reinforcements, more determined than before. Blackthorn's men didn't give up easily, and Jacob was the last man they wanted to leave alone. He grabbed a saddle from the wall and began preparing his horse. His movements were swift, sure. He didn't need to think about it anymore. He knew how to saddle a horse in his sleep. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just preparing to ride out on a routine trip. He was preparing for a fight. And this time, he wasn't going to be caught off guard. The barn door creaked open, the sound echoing through the silence. Jacob froze, his hands still on the saddle, and his body tensed. He hadn't expected anyone to come by tonight. Not after the drifters had left. He slowly turned toward the door, his fingers inching toward the revolver at his side. But as the figure stepped into the barn, Jacob relaxed, his shoulders dropping slightly in relief. It was Bill, one of the few men in Larkspur who Jacob had come to trust. Bill wasn't just a local. He had seen the darker side of life in the West, and Jacob knew he could rely on him when things got tough. "You expecting company? Or is this just a late-night visit?" Bill said, his voice low, but filled with a knowing edge. He had seen enough of Jacob's past to know that nothing ever came easy for him. Jacob gave a wry smile, hoping for a quiet night, but that's never been my luck. He paused, his eyes hardening as he looked at Bill. "The drifters who came by earlier, they won't be the last. They're just the beginning." Bill nodded, his expression serious. "I heard some talk around town. Some of those men don't know when to quit. And from what I've heard, Blackthorn's boys don't like to leave loose ends." Jacob exhaled, his mind working over the options. Bill was right. If Blackthorn's gang was involved, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And right now, what they wanted was Jacob Cross, his land, and everything he had worked for. "I'm leaving," Jacob said, his voice cold and calculated. "I'm heading for Larkspur. We'll need to warn the town. Get them ready. If Blackthorn's men are coming, we can't wait around here for them to show up on our doorstep." Bill raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Leaving your farm? Thought you were done with all that." "I didn't leave it all behind," Jacob said quietly, his eyes hardening. "I just found something worth protecting, but I'm not about to let Blackthorn take it. Not without a fight." Bill didn't argue. He had been around long enough to know that Jacob's mind was already made up. He had a reputation for getting things done, and when it came to protecting what mattered, Jacob Cross was a force to be reckoned with. "All right," Bill said, his tone agreeing with Jacob's resolve. "Let's get moving then. We can't waste any more time." Jacob swung himself up onto his horse, the saddle creaking beneath his weight as he kicked the horse into a trot. Bill followed behind him, riding alongside as the two men made their way toward Larkspur. The town was only a few miles away, but the ride felt longer with each passing minute, the tension in the air growing heavier as they neared the town. Jacob's mind was already working over the plan. He would talk to the town leaders, get them to prepare. He wasn't sure how much help they would be, but it was better than nothing. He had made it this far on his own, but this wasn't a fight he could win alone. As they neared the outskirts of Larkspur, Jacob's gaze hardened. The town was still, quiet under the dark sky, but Jacob knew the silence wouldn't last. Not for long. The faint glow of lanterns illuminated the town of Larkspur as Jacob and Bill approached on horseback. The dust kicked up by their horses swirled around them as the town came into view. Sleepy, quiet, and still, like the calm before a storm. Jacob's heart beat in a steady rhythm, but there was a pressure in his chest, a weight that hadn't been there before. Larkspur wasn't ready for what was coming. No one ever was. And Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this time, he wouldn't be able to stop the tide that was about to wash over them. As they rode through the narrow streets, Jacob's eyes scanned the familiar buildings, the small shops, the saloon, and the general store. They were all quiet, most of the townsfolk tucked in for the night, oblivious to the danger that loomed. Jacob had hoped that the quiet life he had built here would keep him safe, but he knew better than that. Safety in the West was a fleeting thing. It could vanish in a heartbeat, just like the drifters had vanished earlier, leaving only a memory of what had been. The silence was deceiving. The storm was coming, and it was time to prepare for it. Bill broke the silence as they reached the edge of town. "You think they'll listen to us?" he asked, his voice low. "The folks around here, they're not used to this kind of trouble." Jacob didn't answer immediately. Instead, he urged his horse forward, heading toward the town hall, the building that stood as the center of authority in Larkspur. The town didn't have much in terms of a formal government, but it had its leaders, men and women who had lived through enough hardship to know when things were about to go south. "We'll make them listen," Jacob said, his voice firm. "They won't have a choice. If we don't prepare now, we'll have a fight on our hands before the sun rises." Bill nodded, his expression grim. The two men dismounted in front of the town hall, tying their horses to the post. Jacob could feel the weight of the approaching confrontation in his gut, the sense that this was no longer just a matter of surviving. It was a matter of taking a stand. He couldn't let Blackthorn's men trample over this town, couldn't let them take what they had fought to build. Inside the town hall, Jacob found the town leaders gathered around a large table. They looked up as he entered, a mixture of surprise and curiosity in their eyes. Most of them were older folk, the kind who had seen the land change from wild and untamed to the somewhat settled place it was now. Jacob knew them all, people who had come to Larkspur to escape the violence and chaos of the world outside. They didn't want trouble, didn't want to get involved in the bloodshed that marked the borderlands of the West. But Jacob knew that if they didn't take action, they would be swept up in it. "Evening, Jacob," one of the older men, Clint, said, his voice gruff but respectful. "Bill, what brings you out this way at this hour? Ain't like you to be out and about this late." Jacob looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the town leaders. "We've got trouble," he said bluntly. "A group of drifters came by my place today. I took care of them, but this isn't over. They're part of something bigger. Blackthorn's men are heading this way." The room fell silent. Jacob could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He had said it. There was no turning back now. Clint raised an eyebrow, his face skeptical. "Blackthorn's men? You sure about that, Jacob? That's mighty serious talk. Those boys don't just come into town for a chat." "I'm sure," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "They're here for me, and they'll do whatever it takes to take me down. But I'm not the only one they're after. If they want me, they'll come for this town, too." There was a murmur of concern around the table, and Jacob could see the uncertainty in their eyes. These were good people, folks who had worked hard to build lives for themselves. They weren't used to violence, not like Jacob had been, but they had to face the reality that the West was a brutal place, and that no one was safe, not even in the quiet little town of Larkspur. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come knocking," Jacob continued, his voice rising with urgency. "We need to prepare. We need to fortify this town, get supplies ready, and make sure everyone knows what's coming." Clint looked around the table, his brow furrowed in thought. "You're asking a lot, Jacob," he said. "This town's peaceful. Folks don't have the resources for a fight like that." "I'm not asking for a war," Jacob said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for a chance to survive. If we don't act now, we'll be buried beneath Blackthorn's boots just like the rest of the land. This town is worth fighting for." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Jacob's words hanging in the air. And then, slowly, Clint nodded. "All right, Jacob, we'll do what we can. But you'd better be right about this. If Blackthorn's men are really coming, we don't have much time." Jacob gave a grim smile. "I'm always right about trouble." The town leaders quickly got to work. Jacob's words had galvanized them, and soon they were sending out messengers, gathering what supplies they could, and organizing the town's defenses. The townsfolk, though frightened, rallied behind Jacob. They weren't warriors, but they were survivors. And Jacob knew that if he could give them the tools, the courage to fight back, they'd stand strong. The night passed in a flurry of activity, and by morning, The town of Larkspur was ready. The barricades were set up around the perimeter, the gates reinforced, and watchmen posted at key points. Jacob stood at the center of the town, watching as the people worked together. Men, women, even children, all focused on one thing: survival. And as the sun began to rise, Jacob knew that this was only the calm before the storm. Blackthorn's men would come, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Jacob wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. The past had come knocking on his door once again, and this time, he would make sure that it didn't take everything from him. The sun rose slowly over Larkspur, casting long shadows across the town that had transformed overnight. What had once been a quiet, peaceful place was now a fortress, its people readying themselves for an unknown enemy. Jacob stood in the center of it all, watching the town bustle with activity. The barricades were in place, the horses fed and ready, and the weapons they had were strategically positioned for the defense. Jacob hadn't slept. There was no time for sleep when danger was on the horizon. The drifters who had come by earlier were only the beginning. He could feel it in his gut, the kind of gut feeling that had saved his life countless times before. Blackthorn's men would be on them before the day was over. They had to be. Jacob had been a part of that world long enough to know when a group of men was on the move, hunting someone down, and he knew Blackthorn's crew would be ruthless. Jacob had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. If he could get the townsfolk organized, if they could hold out just long enough to make Blackthorn's men think twice, they might have a chance. They might just survive this. Bill rode up alongside Jacob, his horse kicking up dust as it trotted toward him. Bill had been with Jacob through too many hard times, but even he could sense the weight of what was coming. "Everything's in place," Bill said, his voice rough. "The folks are scared, but they're ready. You really think we can hold out if they come at us head-on?" Jacob looked toward the horizon, his eyes scanning the distance. "I don't know," he replied, his voice steady, but his mind working. "But we don't have a choice. We hold them off as long as we can, slow them down, make them pay for every inch they try to take. If we can do that, we'll have a chance to send a message. Make Blackthorn realize that there are more people in this valley who are ready to fight back." Bill nodded, his face hardening. "You think they'll be bringing more than just the drifters?" "I know they will," Jacob answered. "Blackthorn doesn't let things like this slide. If he thinks we've become a problem, he'll bring every man he has to crush us. But we'll give him something to remember." The two men stood silently for a moment, the weight of the coming battle settling over them. Jacob didn't want to think about what would happen if they failed. The town of Larkspur wasn't ready for a full-blown siege. They didn't have the resources, and the odds were stacked against them. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had fought in enough battles to know that a fight was never decided by the numbers. It was decided by the heart. Jacob turned his eyes toward the barricades again, checking the positions of the townsfolk, making sure everyone was where they needed to be. They had the high ground, which was in their favor, but they didn't have much more than that. They had to make sure every shot counted. Suddenly, there was a shout from the edge of town. "Riders approaching." Jacob's head snapped up, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his side. Bill's expression hardened, and without a word, the two men spurred their horses forward, riding toward the source of the shout. The town was on high alert now, the sound of people scrambling to their positions echoing in the streets. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he neared the edge of the town. He could see a cloud of dust rising in the distance, the unmistakable sign of riders approaching. The sun reflected off their horses as they galloped closer, the riders' silhouettes growing clearer with every passing second. "Stay calm," Jacob murmured to Bill, his voice low but firm. "This is it. Get ready." The riders drew closer, and Jacob could see them clearly now. There were 6 of them, all on horseback, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats and dust. They wore no uniforms, no sign of affiliation, but Jacob knew them. He had seen their kind before. These were Blackthorn's men. The riders slowed as they reached the outskirts of the town, reining their horses in. They didn't make any immediate moves, just watched the town with cold, calculating eyes. "Looks like we're expected," one of them called out, his voice rough, but with a note of amusement. Jacob didn't answer. Instead, He motioned for the townsfolk to hold their positions, to stay behind the barricades. The last thing they needed was to give away their positions too soon. The leader of the group dismounted slowly, a grim smile crossing his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his eyes gleamed with the confidence of a man who had killed before and would do so again. His revolver was strapped to his side, his boots caked in dust from the long ride. "You're Jacob Cross, right?" the man said, his voice carrying over the distance. "Funny. I didn't think I'd find a man like you living out here in the sticks. Thought you were dead." Jacob didn't flinch. "I'm not dead yet," he said simply. The man chuckled, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "You might as well be. We've been sent to settle an old score. Blackthorn doesn't like people who make trouble for his men. And you, my friend, are about to make a whole lot more trouble than you're worth." Jacob's eyes hardened. He had seen this kind of arrogance before. These men thought they could just walk in and take what they wanted. They thought they could intimidate him into backing down. But they were wrong. "Get off my land," Jacob said quietly, his voice low but commanding. "And take your men with you." The leader's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "You don't get to make the calls here, Cross. We've been sent to end this. You're going to die today, and there's nothing you can do about it." Jacob's hand moved slowly to the revolver at his side, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. He was ready. He had been ready for this moment long before the drifters had come to his farm. The leader of the group saw the movement and smirked, drawing his own revolver in one swift motion. "I'll give you a chance to draw first, farmer," he said, his voice taunting. "Let's see if you still have the speed." Jacob didn't hesitate. His hand was already on the revolver, the motion smooth, the draw as natural as breathing. The world seemed to slow as his finger curled around the trigger, the sound of the shot ringing out before the leader had even raised his weapon. The drifter's body jerked back, and he crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other 5 riders hesitated, their eyes widening in disbelief. They hadn't expected Jacob to be so fast, so decisive. Jacob's revolver was already back in its holster, the calmness of his actions belying the tension that filled the air. "Who's next?" he said quietly, his voice cold and steady. The remaining drifters stood frozen for a moment, the body of their leader already crumpled in the dirt at Jacob's feet. The shot had been clean, precise, one that only a man who had lived 1,000 lives as a gunslinger could make. For a heartbeat, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The 5 riders, their hands hovering near their weapons, didn't know whether to draw or flee. They had never expected this kind of response from a man they thought was just a farmer, a relic of a time long past. Jacob didn't move. His eyes locked onto the riders, his expression unyielding. He had no interest in giving them a show, no need to taunt them. He had made his move. Now, it was up to them to decide how this was going to end. The seconds stretched like hours, but finally, one of the men, a younger rider with a thin mustache and nervous eyes, shifted uneasily in his saddle. The faint glint of fear was enough to signal to the others that this was a fight they weren't sure they could win. The young man started, his voice shaking. "We didn't come here looking for trouble." Jacob's voice was a low growl, barely above a whisper, but carrying all the authority of a man who had faced down death more times than he cared to remember. "Then leave," he said flatly, his eyes never leaving the group. "Go back to Blackthorn. Tell him what you saw here. Tell him he's not going to walk over me. Tell him this valley doesn't belong to him." The young man's eyes flicked from Jacob to his fallen leader, uncertainty gnawing at him. The other riders, still mounted, exchanged glances. They could feel the tension in the air, and they could hear the unspoken question hanging between them. Should they fight, or should they retreat? The silence grew heavier, and then another voice spoke up, a voice roughened by years of hard living, an older rider whose face was etched with the scars of past battles. He was the one who spoke with authority, his eyes narrowing as they moved from Jacob's cold gaze to the body of the leader on the ground. "He's right," the older rider said, his voice hard like gravel. "We came looking for trouble, and we found it. But I don't see a reason to die over it." "You made your point, Cross." Jacob's eyes never wavered as the older man slid his hand away from his gun, a signal that the fight wasn't worth it. The others followed suit, slowly and cautiously lowering their weapons. The wind kicked up dust around them, swirling in the quiet tension that still held the air. Jacob stood firm, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, prepared for anything. But there was something in the way the riders shifted, the way their bodies relaxed, that told him they had no interest in pushing him further. The young rider, still pale with fear, seemed to be the last to catch on. He looked to his comrades for reassurance before his eyes landed back on Jacob. With a shaky breath, he spurred his horse, nudging it back toward the road. "We'll leave," he muttered, as if embarrassed by the situation. "Tell Blackthorn. Tell him we didn't find what we came for." The rest of the riders followed, their heads low, their expressions full of unease. They didn't look back at Jacob, didn't make any more noise than necessary as they rode off into the distance, the sound of their hooves fading into the evening twilight. Jacob stood in silence, watching them retreat. His heart rate slowly began to return to normal, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in his chest. He had killed once, and the taste of blood lingered. Even though he had known it was inevitable, he had never wanted to kill again. But he would do it, and he would keep doing it, if it meant keeping this town and the people who depended on him safe. Bill rode up beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You think that's the last of them?" he asked, his voice cautious. Jacob shook his head slowly. "No," he replied, his voice low. "That was just the first wave. Blackthorn won't stop. Not until he gets what he wants." Bill nodded grimly. "So what now?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. He watched the drifters' figures fade into the distance, his thoughts running through everything he had planned. He had no illusions about this fight. It wouldn't end here. Not with just one group of riders. Not with a few shots and a couple of bodies in the dirt. "We make our stand," Jacob finally said, his voice firm with resolve. "We get the town ready. Get everyone armed. Set up positions. We've got one chance to make sure they know we're not afraid. We take the fight to them. Make sure Blackthorn knows he can't push us around." Bill didn't question him. "All right," he said, his voice filled with the steady determination that Jacob had come to expect from him. "We'll get it done. But we'll need more than just barricades and rifles. We need reinforcements. I can go out, round up the other towns. If we can get them to stand with us, maybe we'll have a fighting chance." Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first stars were starting to appear in the darkening sky. He knew this wasn't just about Larkspur anymore. It was about more than a farm. It was about sending a message that the West wasn't just going to let Blackthorn and his men trample over it. They had taken enough from the land, and it was time to make them pay for it. "We get reinforcements," Jacob said, his voice cold and sure. "We make sure Blackthorn knows this valley belongs to those who fight for it." As Bill rode off to gather the reinforcements, Jacob stood alone for a moment, his mind racing with the knowledge of what was coming. The storm was far from over, but Jacob wasn't going to let it break him. This time, he would fight to protect everything he had built. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Jacob had given the orders, and the townsfolk had followed without hesitation. They weren't soldiers, and they weren't prepared for a fight of this scale, but they were ready to defend what was theirs. Each man, woman, and child had a role to play in the defense of Larkspur, and everyone knew what was at stake. Jacob had never been a leader of people, but in the West, circumstances didn't always give you a choice. He moved through the town, organizing the defenses. Watchtowers had been built, rifles and pistols distributed, and the town's fortifications were reinforced with whatever they could find. The old general store had been turned into an armory, the saloon a makeshift barracks. Bill had left earlier that morning to gather reinforcements from nearby towns. Jacob trusted him, knew that if anyone could convince the neighboring settlements to stand with them, it was Bill. But he didn't expect them to return for a while. It would be up to Jacob and the people of Larkspur to hold their ground for as long as they could. The days stretched long, the sun beating down mercilessly as the tension in the air grew thicker. Jacob stood on the porch of his farm, looking out over the fields that had once been his peace. Now, they were the ground of a battle he hadn't wanted, a battle he would fight to protect his life and the lives of those in Larkspur. It was late in the afternoon when the first signs of movement came. a small dust cloud rising from the east. At first, Jacob didn't think much of it, just another group of travelers or maybe a few more drifters passing through. But as the dust grew thicker and the figures began to form, Jacob's pulse quickened. He knew who it was. "Bill's not back yet," Jacob murmured under his breath, his eyes narrowing. He could see the riders more clearly now. This wasn't just a few drifters. There were more than 20 of them, and they weren't riding casually. They were coming in force. Jacob's heart began to race, but he remained calm. He had a plan, and it was time to put it into motion. The town was ready. He knew the men and women of Larkspur had their positions, that they were hiding behind barricades, waiting for the signal to engage. But Jacob knew that timing was everything. If they could hold them off long enough, the reinforcements might arrive. If they couldn't, well, Jacob would do what he had to do to protect the people of Larkspur. He mounted his horse and rode to the center of town, where the barricades had been set up. His mind raced with strategy. He had to be patient. He couldn't rush into this. Every move had to be precise. Every shot had to count. The riders were getting closer now, and Jacob could feel the anticipation in the air, the heat of the battle already settling in his bones. The riders slowed as they reached the outskirts of town, their horses kicking up the dry dust in the distance. Jacob could see the glint of their weapons, guns drawn, ready for whatever lay ahead. The leader of the group rode ahead of the rest, his large frame towering over the others. Jacob recognized him immediately. It was the man from earlier, the one with the scar on his face. He wasn't alone this time. He had a full crew behind him, and they were armed to the teeth. "Jacob Cross," the leader shouted, his voice loud enough to carry across the field. "We know you're out there. You can't hide forever." Jacob didn't flinch. He remained behind the barricades, waiting. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of the wind. The leader rode closer, his horse snorting and pawing the ground, clearly agitated. "You think you can stop us? Think you can hold us off with these meager defenses?" The man's voice dripped with contempt. "You should have stayed quiet, farmer. Now you've made a real enemy." Jacob's hand tightened around the reins of his horse as he surveyed the group. There were more of them than he had anticipated. His mind worked quickly, calculating their positions, looking for weak spots. He knew they couldn't hold off this many men for long, but they didn't need to hold them off forever. They just needed to slow them down. The leader grinned, and Jacob could see the glint of malice in his eyes. He was sure that they were expecting an easy victory, that Larkspur would fall without a fight. But Jacob wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. "Make your move," Jacob said quietly to himself, his eyes never leaving the leaders. The moment stretched on, an endless silence hanging in the air. And then, with a sudden movement, Jacob signaled, "Now." The barricades erupted with gunfire as the townsfolk opened fire. The sharp crack of rifles and pistols rang through the air, the sound of it echoing through the streets. The drifters had been expecting resistance, but not like this. The first few riders were knocked from their horses before they could even draw their guns. The rest of the group scrambled, their horses rearing in panic as the town's defenders held their ground behind the barricades. Jacob moved swiftly, firing his revolver with deadly accuracy. The shots rang out, taking down one drifter after another as he made his way down the line. His mind was calm, his movements precise. This was what he had trained for, even if he hadn't wanted to return to it. He had to protect the people of this town, no matter the cost. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, the sound of gunfire and shouting filling the streets. Jacob could see the fear in the eyes of the drifters now, the realization settling in that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. They had underestimated Larkspur, underestimated him, and that was a mistake they would pay for. But Jacob knew this wasn't the end. He could feel it in his gut. The rest of Blackthorn's men were still out there, and if they didn't finish this now, the reinforcements would arrive, and they'd be overwhelmed. As the last of the riders scattered, Jacob stood at the center of the street, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. The dust settled in the street, the ringing of gunfire fading into the distance, leaving behind only the soft hum of the wind. Jacob stood motionless, his revolver still in his hand, his eyes scanning the aftermath of the battle. The drifters had been forced to retreat, some dead, others fled, but the damage had been done. The town had taken its first strike, and Jacob knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The townsfolk, though shaken by the violence, began to move cautiously from their positions, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and fear. Some were tending to the wounded, while others stared blankly at the fallen drifters. They hadn't expected this kind of fight. None of them had, but Jacob had trained them well enough to hold their ground. Bill rode up beside Jacob, his face covered in sweat and dirt from the heat of the battle. His horse snorted, its mane wild from the sprint to Larkspur. Bill was breathing heavily, but his eyes were focused. He had seen plenty of fights in his day, but even he could tell this one wasn't over. "That was a damn good fight, Jacob," Bill said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the chaos. "We held him off, but I don't think they're done. We're gonna need more help." Jacob nodded, his gaze still on the road where the riders had retreated. He could see them in the distance, slowly pulling away from the town. They were broken, scattered, but they weren't finished. Jacob knew that Blackthorn wouldn't take kindly to losing a fight like this, and next time, he'd come back with more men. "We've only bought ourselves a little time," Jacob said, his voice grim, "but it's not enough. They'll regroup, and next time, they won't make the same mistake. We need to get reinforcements from nearby towns. Bill, can you round up any more help?" Bill didn't hesitate. "I'll get on it. We need to make sure they don't have a chance to dig in. We can't afford to wait for Blackthorn to strike again. If we don't act fast, we'll be sitting ducks." Jacob's eyes darkened. "I don't plan on being anyone's duck." With a curt nod, Bill turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the distance. Jacob stood still, watching as the town began to recover. The quiet, once so familiar, had been replaced by a different kind of tension, a tension that felt like a storm waiting to break. As Jacob walked back into the center of the town, the townsfolk began to gather, slowly coming out of their hiding places. Some were tending to the wounded, their hands shaky but determined. Others were setting up makeshift barricades, reinforcing the defenses. Jacob could see the fear in their eyes, but he could also see something else: determination. They had fought back, and for the first time in a long while, they felt the strength that came from standing together. Jacob's attention shifted to the young man who had fought alongside him, a farmer who had never touched a gun before today. He was standing near the saloon, his hands trembling as he wiped the blood from his brow. Jacob approached him, his steps deliberate. "You did good," Jacob said, his voice calm but firm. The young man looked up at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know how I did it," he said, his voice shaking. "I've never fired a gun before." Jacob gave him a small smile. "Sometimes you don't need to know how. You just need to do what you have to do." The young man nodded, his expression hardening as he squared his shoulders. "I never thought I'd be fighting like this, but I'd fight for this town. For all of us." Jacob patted him on the back, the weight of the situation settling into his bones. "Good. That's exactly what we need right now. You're not just a farmer anymore. You're part of something bigger than yourself." The sound of hooves approaching broke the moment, and Jacob turned toward the road. Bill was back, but he wasn't alone. A small group of riders rode in behind him, their horses covered in sweat from the long ride. The riders were from nearby towns, people who had heard the call for help and had come to Larkspur's aid. They weren't many, but they were a welcome sight. Jacob stepped forward, meeting Bill at the edge of town. Bill looked grim, his face etched with the fatigue of the ride, but his eyes were filled with relief. "We've got reinforcements," Bill said, his voice low. "Not a lot, but it'll help. The towns around here are ready to fight. They don't want Blackthorn taking anything else." Jacob nodded, his mind already calculating their next move. The reinforcements would give them the edge they needed, but only if they acted quickly. "Good," Jacob said, his eyes scanning the new group of riders. "We've got work to do. We need to fortify the town, reinforce the barricades, and get everyone armed and ready. Blackthorn won't stop here. He'll be back with more men, and we need to be ready." As the riders dismounted and began helping with the town's defenses, Jacob moved to the center of the group, taking charge. He directed them to key positions, making sure that everyone knew their role. There wasn't much time to waste. If Blackthorn's men were regrouping, they would be back soon, and this time, Jacob would make sure they didn't have the element of surprise on their side. The sun was beginning to set, casting a fiery orange glow over the horizon. The sky streaked with reds and purples. It seemed almost peaceful, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the night was about to bring more than just the calm of dusk. He could feel it in the air, the tension, the waiting. The storm was coming, and they had no choice but to face it. As the town worked to prepare, Jacob stepped over to one of the wooden barricades near the edge of the town. He placed a hand on it, feeling the weight of the moment. The barricades would hold for a while, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not when Blackthorn's men returned with numbers and the firepower to tear through them. The thought gnawed at him, but there was no time for doubt. "Jacob," Bill called from behind him, and Jacob turned to see his friend riding over. "The town's ready. We've got people set up for the defense, but there's one thing we can't ignore. The road leading to the south. It's wide open. If Blackthorn sends a flank, it'll cut us off from the main escape route." Jacob's mind worked quickly. He didn't have the luxury of taking a defensive approach at this point. If they were to survive, they would need to take the fight to Blackthorn's men. "We need to hit them first. We won't just wait for them to come to us. We need to set a trap, make them think we're more than we are. We draw them in. Hit them fast and hit them hard." Bill looked uncertain for a moment, but his gaze hardened as he nodded. "I'll get the men ready. We'll do what we can." Jacob's gaze followed Bill as he rode off to organize the rest of the reinforcements. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was unshakable. This town wasn't just a place to him. It was home, and no matter how many outlaws Blackthorn sent, Jacob wasn't going to let them take it from him without a fight. By nightfall, the plan was set. The town was as ready as it could be. The riders from the other towns had their rifles at the ready, and the women and children had been hidden in the farthest corners of the town, away from the inevitable violence. Jacob knew the chances were slim. Even with the reinforcements, even with the element of surprise on their side, Blackthorn's men would come with the strength of a storm. But they had no choice. The hours passed in a blur, the darkness stretching long as Jacob and his men took their positions, waiting for the first signs of Blackthorn's advance. The night was filled with the sound of hooves approaching from the distance, slowly, steadily, and Jacob's heart raced as he watched through the slit in the barricade. He could see them now, the first few riders on horseback, moving cautiously toward the town. Jacob took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the grip of his revolver. He had no illusions about what was coming. He was a man who had lived through enough battles to know how this went. His job wasn't to win the war, just to buy enough time for the people of Larkspur to get out alive. "Now," he whispered. The signal was given, and the quiet of the night shattered. Rifle shots rang out in the distance as Jacob's men opened fire on the approaching riders, aiming for the weak points in the flank. The gunfire cut through the air, the first sign of chaos, but Jacob didn't hesitate. His own revolver was out, his aim swift and practiced as he fired, knocking one rider off his horse before he could even reach the barricades. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. There was nothing but the sound of gunfire and the pounding of hooves as the two sides clashed. Jacob kept his eyes on the road, watching for the reinforcements, waiting for them to come. The first wave of Blackthorn's men charged forward, their faces filled with rage and determination. But Jacob's men fought back with equal ferocity. Each shot was calculated, each movement deliberate. They had been preparing for this, even if it was just for a few days. They weren't going to give up easily. But then, the real force of Blackthorn's army showed up. More than twice the number of riders they had anticipated. Jacob's heart sank as the reinforcements broke through, charging toward the town with a ferocity that could tear through the last of their defenses. The battle raged on, the sounds of the fight rising to a deafening crescendo. Jacob's mind was racing, trying to keep track of every move. They had to hold on, just a little longer. But the odds were growing slimmer with each passing minute. And then, just as he feared, he saw the man in the distance. The one who had been pulling the strings behind Blackthorn's crew, the man who had orchestrated all of this. Rufus Blackthorn himself was riding toward Larkspur, his face set in a grim, determined expression. Jacob knew that the real battle was yet to come. This wasn't just about surviving the fight. It was about facing the man who had once ruled over the lawless frontier with fear and violence. And Jacob wasn't about to let him take anything else from him. The roar of the battle grew louder as Blackthorn's men poured into the town, their guns blazing as they advanced. Jacob's heart raced, his fingers steady on the trigger as he fired into the mass of riders. The barricades were holding for now, but it was clear they wouldn't last much longer. The sounds of gunshots, shouting, and the thundering of hooves filled the air, a chaotic symphony that threatened to drown out everything else. Jacob's eyes scanned the battlefield, calculating each move, watching for any openings, any weaknesses. The reinforcements had held their ground so far, but the weight of Blackthorn's army was too much. More riders were coming, circling the town, trying to outflank them. The lines were beginning to break. He could see Bill, firing from a barricade near the saloon, shouting orders to the townsfolk who were doing their best to return fire. The fear on their faces was undeniable, but there was something else there too, something more powerful: determination. They weren't running. They weren't giving up. For the first time in a long time, Jacob saw that they weren't just defending their homes. They were fighting for their future. Jacob's gaze swept over the battlefield, and his breath caught in his throat as he spotted him. Rufus Blackthorn was riding in at the front of the charge, his black coat billowing out behind him like a dark cloud. He had the unmistakable presence of a man who was used to taking what he wanted, and for a brief moment, Jacob could almost feel the weight of Blackthorn's reputation hanging in the air. But Jacob wasn't afraid. He had faced down men like Blackthorn before, men who thought they could intimidate him, crush him with their power and influence. But this time, it wasn't just about Jacob Cross. This was about the people of Larkspur, and he would protect them, even if it meant facing the most feared outlaw in the West. Jacob raised his rifle, his focus sharp as he took aim at Blackthorn, who was leading the charge on horseback. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, a sudden movement caught his eye. One of Blackthorn's men was charging directly toward him, a massive figure wielding a rifle. Jacob didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he drew his revolver and fired, the shot ringing out with deadly accuracy. The man dropped from his horse with a thud, the rifle falling from his hands. Jacob's pulse quickened, but he didn't allow himself to feel relief. He had a job to do, and Blackthorn was still coming. Rufus Blackthorn was close now, his horse charging toward the barricade with the intent to break through. Jacob could see the malicious grin on his face, the confidence in his every move. But Jacob wasn't going to let him get close. "Cover me," Jacob shouted over the chaos, his voice loud as he turned to the group of townsfolk huddled behind the barricades. "Keep their heads down." Without waiting for a response, Jacob spurred his horse into motion, galloping toward the center of the town. The noise of the battle surrounded him, but his focus was singular: Blackthorn. He had to get to him. He had to face him head-on. As Jacob reached the middle of the street, he saw Blackthorn's figure growing larger, his face twisted with anger as he rode forward, leading his men with ruthless efficiency. He was close now, close enough that Jacob could see the glint of the man's revolver at his side. Jacob's fingers twitched toward his own revolver, the familiar weight of it reassuring as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The sound of hooves pounding against the earth seemed to slow as time seemed to stretch. It was just him and Blackthorn now. With a sudden, decisive motion, Jacob drew his revolver and fired. The shot rang out, the bullet finding its mark with deadly accuracy, striking Blackthorn in the shoulder. The impact sent Blackthorn reeling, his horse skittering to the side as he was thrown off balance. The outlaw leader grunted in pain, his hand instinctively reaching for his wound. But Jacob wasn't finished. Before Blackthorn could recover, Jacob spurred his horse forward, riding straight at him, his revolver aimed and ready. The distance between them closed quickly, and Jacob's mind was clear. He had been in situations like this before, and he wasn't about to let Blackthorn get the better of him now. The outlaw leader was still scrambling to regain his footing, but Jacob was faster. With a flash of movement, Jacob dismounted his horse and closed the gap, his revolver aimed squarely at Blackthorn's chest. "You're done?" Blackthorn, Jacob said coldly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This ends now. Blackthorn's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. You think this will stop me? He spat, his voice strained from the pain in his shoulder. You're just a farmer, Cross. A man with no future, no allies. You think this little town can stand against me? Jacob didn't flinch. This town is worth more than you'll ever know, and I'm not going to let you destroy it. With that, Jacob pulled the trigger once more. The bullet struck Blackthorn square in the chest. The leader's body went limp, and he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The sound of the shot echoed through the battlefield, a clear signal that the man who had terrorized so many had finally met his end. For a moment, everything was still. The gunfire slowed as Blackthorn's men hesitated, confusion and fear spreading through their ranks. They had lost their leader, and without him, the force that had seemed so unstoppable suddenly seemed vulnerable. Jacob's men, encouraged by the fall of Blackthorn, surged forward, the momentum shifting in their favor. The townsfolk who had been hiding behind barricades began to move, returning fire with renewed confidence. Bill's reinforcements had arrived just in time, adding to the chaos for Blackthorn's men. Jacob stood still for a moment, his chest heaving, his revolver still in hand. He watched as the remaining drifters began to retreat, their once confident charge faltering as the tide of battle turned. Jacob had known that this fight wasn't over, but it seemed now that they had won a crucial victory. For now, the town of Larkspur was safe. But Jacob knew this was just the beginning. Blackthorn's men would regroup, and soon enough, they'd be back. But for today, they had one. And that was enough. The battle had quieted, and the air hung heavy with the aftermath of violence. Larkspur had been saved, for now. But Jacob knew this wasn't the end. The drifters, the outlaws under Blackthorn's banner, were a ruthless bunch, and it would take more than one victory to drive them out for good. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the heat of the day still clinging to his skin. His heart was still racing, but there was something else now, something that weighed on him. The town of Larkspur had taken its first real blow. They had fought back, yes, but the fear in the air wasn't gone. It was only buried for the moment. Jacob turned toward the center of the town, where people had gathered in the streets. The wounded were being treated, and a few of the reinforcements from the nearby towns were helping to carry those who had fallen. The town, though battered, had held. Bill rode up beside Jacob, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his expression tired but resolute. He dismounted and approached Jacob, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver as he surveyed the town. Well, Bill said, his voice low, we did it. We held them off. Jacob's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the last remnants of Blackthorn's men were disappearing into the distance. We bought ourselves some time, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. But they'll come back. Blackthorn won't leave us alone. Not now that we've killed his right hand. Bill sighed, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. That's true. I've seen enough of his men to know they don't forget when you take one of their own. They'll be back. And they'll be angrier. Jacob nodded grimly. He had seen men like Blackthorn before. Men who couldn't tolerate weakness, who couldn't stand to lose. And Jacob knew that they would be back soon. Blackthorn would gather his forces, rally his men, and return with a vengeance. I need to talk to the town leaders, Jacob said, turning away from Bill and making his way toward the town hall. We need to plan our next move. We need to be ready for when Blackthorn comes back. Bill followed him, his boots crunching on the dirt as they walked through the town. What's the plan? He asked. We prepare for another fight, Jacob replied. We don't know when they'll come, but we need to be ready. We need to get more reinforcements, fortify the town even more, and set up traps. Blackthorn's men won't play fair, but we can outsmart them. We don't just wait for them to come to us. We draw them in. Bill's eyes narrowed, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I like that plan. It's not just about fighting. It's about making them regret ever stepping foot here. Jacob nodded. Exactly. As they reached the town hall, Jacob could see the leaders of Larkspur gathered inside, looking worn but determined. The old men and women who had called this town home for decades were meeting in the center of the room, discussing their next steps. They didn't have the luxury of time. The war for Larkspur's survival was already here. Inside, Jacob addressed the town leaders. His voice was steady, but there was a fire in it, an urgency that could not be ignored. "We've held them off for now," Jacob began, looking around at the gathered group, "but Blackthorn will return. He'll come with more men, more firepower. We need to be ready. We need to fortify the town even more. We can't afford to take any chances." The town leaders listened intently, nodding as Jacob spoke. They knew what was at stake. This was their home, their families, and their livelihoods. If they lost this fight, they'd lose everything. "We can reinforce the barricades, set up more traps," one of the older men said, his voice raspy from shouting during the battle. "But we need more supplies, more ammunition. We'll need help." Jacob's eyes hardened. "I'm already working on getting more reinforcements. We need to send word to every town within 100 miles. We need every man and woman who's willing to fight. This is about survival. It's not just about us. It's about making sure Blackthorn and his men never think they can just walk into this valley and take what they want." There was a murmur of agreement around the room, and Jacob could feel the shift in the room. The people of Larkspur had already made it through one battle. They weren't about to back down now. One of the younger women, a farmer who had been helping with the wounded, spoke up. "What about the civilians? The children? What happens if we can't hold them off?" Jacob turned to her, his expression softening. "We'll do everything we can to protect everyone, but if it comes to it, we'll have to evacuate. The last thing we want is to put the children in harm's way." The woman nodded, her face pale but determined. "And if we can't leave, then we fight," Jacob said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "We fight until there's nothing left to fight for. This town is worth saving, and if Blackthorn wants to take it from us, he's going to have to kill every last one of us." The room went quiet at Jacob's words, the weight of what he was saying settling over the group. The truth was clear now. The people of Larkspur were in this together, whether they liked it or not. Jacob turned to Bill, who had been standing silently beside him. "We'll need to get the women and children out if things go south," he said. "But we make sure everyone knows the plan. If Blackthorn thinks he can come in and take what's ours, he's going to have another thing coming." Bill nodded. "Let's make it happen. I'll get to work on the reinforcements. But we need to act fast." Jacob's eyes flicked over the group again. "We don't have much time, but we won't be caught off guard. We fight with everything we've got." The town of Larkspur hummed with a strange, almost surreal energy as the hours passed. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a deep blue over the valley, and the streets that had once felt like home now seemed like a battlefield waiting to be claimed. Jacob had spent most of the evening working with the town leaders, finalizing their plans. The barricades were reinforced, the weapons had been double-checked, and the civilians were moved to safety, at least for now. Everyone who could hold a rifle was in position, ready for the fight that they knew was coming. But despite the preparations, a quiet dread hung in the air. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this time would be different. Blackthorn would be back, and he wouldn't be the only one. The horses were restless, their hooves tapping against the earth as the wind picked up, swirling dust through the town. Jacob stood outside the town hall, his hands resting on the railing as he stared out into the darkness. His thoughts were sharp, focused, but a part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift, something beyond his control. Bill rode back into town around midnight, his horse exhausted from the long ride. Jacob had sent him to gather reinforcements, to get as many men and women as possible to stand alongside them. Bill's horse slowed to a trot as it approached the center of the town. Jacob's gaze met his before Bill even spoke. The look on Bill's face was enough to tell Jacob that they were not ready for what was coming. "You were right to be worried," Bill said as he dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. "I got word from the surrounding towns. They've heard what happened here. Most of them won't be able to make it in time. Some of the bigger towns can spare a few men, but it's not nearly enough." Jacob's heart sank, but he kept his expression steady. He had known that reinforcements would be hard to come by. Blackthorn had a way of scaring people off. Still, he had hoped for more. "So what does that leave us with?" Jacob asked, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Bill paused. running a hand through his hair. "We're on our own, at least for tonight. We've got some extra hands, mostly women and children who can shoot, a few veterans who've seen some action."
"It's not much, but it's what we have."
Jacob swallowed the knot in his throat and nodded. "All right."
"We fight with what we have."
Bill gave him a tight smile, the kind of smile Jacob had seen 1,000 times. A smile that was both a reassurance and a sign of shared understanding. It was the kind of smile men wore when they knew what was coming, but had no choice but to face it head-on. "Let's get back to the others. We've still got a few hours to prepare," Bill said, as he turned toward the barricades. Jacob followed him into the center of town. The makeshift defenses were in place, but Jacob had no illusions about how long they would last. Blackthorn's men wouldn't just storm the town. They would break it down, piece by piece, testing the weakest points until the whole structure crumbled. The townsfolk were gathered near the barricades, talking quietly, their faces tense with fear and determination. Jacob could hear the occasional whisper of, "What if we can't hold them off?" Or, "Is this really going to work?" The words hung in the air, but Jacob didn't acknowledge them. He didn't have to. The people here knew what was at stake. He walked to the center of the group and climbed atop a wooden crate, raising his hand for silence. The murmurs died down, and every eye in the town turned to him. "We've fought before, but this is different," Jacob began, his voice steady but hard, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. "This isn't just about keeping our homes. It's about making sure that Blackthorn and anyone who follows him knows that we won't back down. They're going to try to break us. They think they can take this town and leave without consequences." He paused for a moment, looking over the crowd. "But we're not like the rest of them. We don't give up. We fight for what's ours. We fight for this land, for our families, for each other." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Jacob could see the fire in their eyes. They were scared, yes, but they were ready. They had no choice. "We hold this town," Jacob continued, his voice rising with the conviction that had always burned in him. "We fight with everything we have. And when Blackthorn comes, we make sure he understands that Larkspur is not just a place on the map. It's a place worth dying for." The crowd erupted in a quiet cheer, their resolve hardening. The women, the men, and even the children who had been trained to fight all stood a little taller. Jacob could see it in their eyes. They might not have been warriors, but they would be fighters now. And in this town, that was all that mattered. Jacob nodded, stepping down from the crate and turning back to the barricades. "Let's make sure we're ready. They'll be here soon enough." The night stretched on, but the preparation didn't stop. Jacob moved quickly through the town, checking each barricade, making sure that everyone knew their positions. The sound of muffled voices filled the air as the town solidified its defenses. He checked the makeshift weapons cache and made sure that every rifle, every pistol, was loaded and ready. The sky had darkened fully now, the stars hidden behind the low-hanging clouds that threatened rain. Jacob stood still for a moment, looking at the darkened sky. In the west, you learn to read the weather, to feel the change in the air. And tonight, everything felt like the calm before a storm. And that storm wasn't far off. Jacob's thoughts turned to the coming fight. Blackthorn would come. He would bring his men, and he would stop at nothing to take what he wanted. But Jacob was ready. He had faced down men like Blackthorn before. And this time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a future. He turned back toward the barricades, his heart steady and his mind clear. The fight was about to begin, and Jacob wasn't going to let anyone take this from him. The night was thick with anticipation, the town of Larkspur holding its breath as Jacob and his men prepared for what was to come. The barricades were fortified, the women and children hidden in the cellars, and the town's defenders stood at their posts, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. The clock seemed to crawl, each minute stretching endlessly as the hours ticked by. Jacob stood at the edge of town, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his revolver. The wind carried a faint smell of dust, of the open desert, and Jacob could hear the faintest sound of hooves in the distance. He knew Blackthorn's men were coming. He could feel it in the air. The tension, the knowledge that the next few hours would determine whether Larkspur would survive or fall. "Do you think reinforcements will make it in time?" Bill asked, his voice cutting through the silence as he rode up to Jacob's side. The concern was evident in his tone, but there was also a hint of optimism. Jacob could see it in his eyes, the same thing he felt himself: hope. They had held the town before, and they could do it again. "They'll get here when they get here," Jacob replied, his gaze still fixed on the distance. "Until then, it's just us." Bill nodded, though the doubt in his eyes couldn't be hidden. "We'll make it count," he said firmly, clapping Jacob on the shoulder. "I know we will." The wind picked up again, stirring the dust and carrying with it a low rumble, the distant sound of horses' hooves drawing nearer. Jacob's grip tightened on his revolver. He could feel his heart racing, but his hands were steady. He had done this before. He had fought harder battles, faced down enemies who outnumbered him, and he had survived. He was going to survive this too. The distant sound grew louder, closer now, and Jacob motioned for Bill to move to his position. "Get ready," he muttered. "It's about to get real." The first rider appeared on the horizon, followed by another, and then another. The dust they kicked up clouded the air, making it difficult to see exactly how many men were coming. But Jacob didn't need to see them clearly. He knew they were coming for him, coming to finish what Blackthorn's men had started. They wouldn't just try to take the town. They'd come with everything they had, hoping to break the people of Larkspur. "Hold your fire," Jacob ordered, his voice firm as the riders drew closer. He could hear the thunder of hooves now, the sound almost deafening. The tension in the air was electric, the silence before the storm thick and heavy. The first wave of Blackthorn's riders broke through the line of sight, and Jacob's eyes locked on the leader, the same man with the scar on his face. He recognized him instantly. The man who had threatened him before, the one who had tried to intimidate him into submission. This time, it wasn't going to work. "Open fire," Jacob shouted. The crack of gunfire shattered the night as rifles and pistols erupted in a deafening chorus. Jacob ducked behind the barricade, his revolver at the ready as the first rider fell from his horse, the bullet finding its mark in his chest. More shots rang out, and Jacob's pulse quickened as the battle began in earnest. The drifters returned fire, but their aim was wild. They hadn't expected the resistance, hadn't anticipated that the town of Larkspur would fight back this fiercely. But they weren't the only ones with guns, and they weren't the only ones with something to protect. Jacob moved quickly, firing on the next rider who tried to advance, his bullet striking the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. The riders began to scatter, some retreating, others charging forward in desperation. But the town's defenders held their ground. Each shot counted, each man and woman standing side by side to ensure that Larkspur didn't fall. The wind whipped through the streets as Jacob crouched low, keeping his head down as more riders rode past, their faces filled with rage. He could see the panic in their eyes as they tried to regroup, but it was too late. They had underestimated the resolve of Larkspur. They had underestimated Jacob Cross. "Bill," Jacob shouted, spotting his friend near the edge of the barricade. "Flank them on the left. Push them back toward the hill." Bill nodded, signaling to the rest of the reinforcements as they spread out. Jacob saw them, more riders coming in from the side, trying to catch them off guard. But the townsfolk were ready, already moving to cut them off at the pass. The battle raged on, the sounds of gunfire and shouting filling the streets as Jacob and his men fought back with everything they had. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. Jacob could feel the adrenaline surge through his veins as he moved from one barricade to the next, his revolver never faltering, his aim true. But just as he thought they were gaining the upper hand, a familiar, haunting voice rang out above the chaos. "Enough!" Jacob froze, his heart leaping into his throat as he turned toward the source of the voice. There, at the edge of the battlefield, was Blackthorn himself, standing tall, a dark figure at the head of his men, his eyes filled with cold fury. He was unharmed, but his presence was commanding, the kind of presence that made men pause, made them hesitate. Jacob didn't hesitate. He knew what had to be done. "Hold your fire," Jacob shouted again, his voice carrying over the battlefield. The gunfire began to slow, the shots petering out as the townsfolk held their positions. Blackthorn raised a hand, signaling for his men to stop. "You fought well, Cross," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "But this town is mine now. You're out of time." Jacob stood tall, his revolver still in his hand, his eyes locked on Blackthorn. "Not as long as I'm breathing," Jacob replied, his voice low and steady. For a long moment, they stared at each other, man against man, each knowing what the other was capable of. Blackthorn's eyes were full of cold calculation, but Jacob's were filled with something more, something stronger. "Make your move, Blackthorn," Jacob said quietly, his voice low but filled with unshakable resolve. "But know this, you will never take Larkspur. Not while I'm still standing." The standoff in the middle of the street stretched on, a battle of wills as much as weapons. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest, but his hand remained steady on the grip of his revolver. Across from him, Blackthorn stood with an air of ruthless calm, his revolver resting at his side, but the malice in his eyes made it clear that he was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, as the gunfight around them slowly subsided. It was as if the whole town held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "You're a stubborn man, Cross," Blackthorn said, his voice low but carrying an edge of contempt. "I admire that. But this town? It was never meant for you. People like you don't get to live quietly. You don't get to decide when it's over." Jacob took a slow breath, his eyes locked on Blackthorn's. "Maybe not," he said, his voice steady, "but I decide when it ends for me.
And for this town."
The words were a challenge, a declaration, and as Jacob spoke them, the weight of the situation settled deeper into his bones. The battle wasn't over yet. Blackthorn's men were regrouping, but they were still hesitant, unsure of their next move. They knew their leader had been defeated before, and now they had to deal with the man who had done it. Jacob wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a threat, a real one. Blackthorn's lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You think you've won just because you shot a few of my men? I've got more where that came from." Jacob didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let Blackthorn's words get under his skin. "You've lost," Jacob said simply, "and when the dust settles, you'll know it." There was a long pause, where it seemed like the whole world held its breath. The wind rustled the trees, and the faint scent of smoke filled the air. Jacob's mind raced, weighing his options. He knew Blackthorn wouldn't just walk away. He would send more men, more firepower, and try to break Larkspur. But this town wasn't going to break. Not today. With a sudden, sharp movement, Blackthorn drew his revolver, aiming it directly at Jacob. But Jacob was faster. In a blur, his hand moved to his own holster, and before Blackthorn could react, the crack of gunfire split the air. Blackthorn's revolver flew from his hand as a bullet struck the wrist that held it. He stumbled back, a shout of pain escaping his lips as he clutched at his bleeding arm. His men hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, while Jacob's shot rang true. "That's your last warning, Blackthorn," Jacob said quietly, his voice cold and steady. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to make a spectacle of it. He knew what had to be done, and the others were beginning to realize it too. Jacob wasn't just a farmer. He was a man who would protect his own at any cost. Blackthorn's eyes burned with fury, but he didn't make another move toward his revolver. He staggered to his feet, his men slowly gathering behind him, unsure of whether to follow their leader or fall back. Jacob didn't wait for them to make up their minds. His hand was already moving toward his revolver again, but this time, it wasn't for another shot. This time, it was a signal.
"Get to cover,"
Jacob shouted, his voice carrying over the field. "Now, we're not done yet." The townsfolk responded immediately. They had already learned the rhythm of battle, the pattern of how to hold their ground, and now it was time to put everything into motion. The barricades became more than just obstacles. They became shields, and the townsfolk moved as one, filling the gaps in their defenses, positioning themselves for the next wave. Blackthorn's men hesitated again, their eyes flicking from their wounded leader to Jacob and back again. They had seen the efficiency of Larkspur's defense, and they knew they couldn't just walk in and take over. The tide had shifted, and now they were the ones on the back foot. Jacob knew that the moment had passed. He had held them off, but only for now. The real test would come when Blackthorn regrouped, when he brought in the rest of his forces, when the attack would become a siege. But Jacob was ready. He had been ready for this from the start. "Bill," Jacob shouted, turning toward his friend as he helped secure the town's defenses. "Get the others ready. We make our stand now." Bill nodded, his face set in a determined grimace. "We've got this, Jacob. We'll make him regret ever crossing us." Jacob's mind flashed back to the last few days, the ambushes, the planning, the hard choices. This was more than just a fight for a farm. It was a fight for a future. The future of Larkspur, the future of the people who had chosen to stand with him, and the future of the land that had once been a home to outlaws but could now be a sanctuary for those who were willing to fight for it. They wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. As the last remnants of Blackthorn's men began to retreat, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had broken the first wave, but the storm that was about to hit them would test every ounce of their resolve. But Jacob wasn't about to back down. He wasn't going to let Blackthorn take anything else from this town. He would stand, with his revolver in hand and his people behind him, and he would fight until his last breath to protect the future they had built. "Let them come," Jacob said quietly to himself, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. "We're ready." The night stretched on, but the sky was growing lighter as dawn approached, casting a pale blue hue over the battlefield. The sounds of battle had begun to quiet, replaced by the slow thrum of exhaustion that had settled over the people of Larkspur. Jacob stood still amidst the silence, his eyes scanning the horizon where Blackthorn's men had retreated. The tension in the air was palpable, the calm before the storm. The fight was far from over. They had pushed Blackthorn's men back for now, but Jacob knew that this was just the first wave. Blackthorn wouldn't retreat for long. He would regroup, send more men, and come at them with everything he had. Jacob had seen it before, the kind of stubborn persistence that Blackthorn had. And Jacob knew that the next time they came, they wouldn't be so easily stopped. "How are we holding up?" Jacob asked, turning toward Bill, who had been coordinating the defense from the town's barricades. Bill wiped the sweat from his forehead, his face grim. "We're holding, but not for long. We've got a lot of wounded, and the reinforcements we've got are stretched thin. If Blackthorn's men come back in full force, we might not last." Jacob's jaw tightened as he thought about their options. They didn't have the luxury of time, and they certainly didn't have the resources for a prolonged siege. But they had something Blackthorn didn't, their resolve. "We don't wait for them to come back," Jacob said firmly. "We go to them." Bill blinked, confused at first, but then his eyes narrowed, understanding slowly creeping into his expression. "You're saying we take the fight to them? But they'll be ready for us. They'll be ready for a fight," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "But we're going to make sure they're not ready for the kind of fight we're bringing." Bill nodded slowly, his face hardening. "You've got a plan." Jacob looked over at the town's gathered defenders, the townsfolk who had come together to protect what was theirs. He had seen the fear in their eyes, but he had also seen the courage in their hearts. They had been through hell, and they were still standing. It wasn't just about defending their homes anymore. It was about taking a stand. "We've been defending Larkspur long enough," Jacob said. "Now, we're going on the offensive. We draw them in, hit them where it hurts, and make sure they know we won't back down." The sun began to rise fully, casting a golden glow over the town as Jacob turned to the rest of the defenders. He could see the fatigue in their faces, the weariness from the long hours of fighting. But he also saw something else, a fire, a resolve that had only grown stronger in the face of adversity. They were ready, and so was he. "Gather up," Jacob shouted, his voice carrying across the town. "We're going to take the fight to Blackthorn. We're going to show him that Larkspur is not just a town. It's a force to be reckoned with." The townsfolk gathered quickly, moving toward the town center, their eyes filled with determination. Jacob stood tall in the midst of them, his mind already working over the strategy. He knew Blackthorn's tactics. He had seen them before. They would try to split their forces, overwhelm them from multiple directions. But Jacob wasn't going to let that happen. This time, they would fight smart. This time, they would make sure Blackthorn regretted ever setting foot in Larkspur. Bill rode up beside Jacob, his face set in a determined expression. "What's the plan, Jacob?" "We hit them where they're weak," Jacob said. "We lure them in with a small group and make them think they have the advantage. Once they're spread out, we strike hard. We hit their flank, cut them off from their reinforcements, and take them down one by one." Bill nodded. "And if they don't fall for the trap?" "We make them," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "We fight until they do." The group of defenders gathered around Jacob, ready to follow his lead. Jacob felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but he also felt something else, something stronger. This was their chance. This was their moment to take control of their fate, to show Blackthorn and his men that Larkspur was not just a place to take, but a place worth fighting for. They mounted their horses, their eyes focused and determined, the weight of their weapons a reminder of what was at stake. Jacob rode at the front, his mind clear, his focus on the task at hand. The others followed, riding in formation as they moved out of the town and into the open fields. They were going to find Blackthorn's men before they had a chance to regroup. They were going to take the fight to him. The land around them was quiet, the vast expanse of the desert stretching out before them. Jacob could feel the eyes of his men on him, the weight of their trust in his hands. They weren't just following him into battle. They were following him because they believed in what they were fighting for. They rode for hours, making their way through the valley toward Blackthorn's known position. The land was empty, save for the occasional dust devil that spiraled up into the air. But Jacob knew that Blackthorn was out there, waiting, watching. And he knew that they had to strike before he had a chance to prepare. As they neared the outskirts of Blackthorn's camp, Jacob motioned for his men to dismount. The tension was palpable now, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. They were close, so close that Jacob could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They were ready. "We make our stand here," Jacob whispered to Bill, who nodded in return. They set up a series of makeshift barricades, using the natural terrain to their advantage. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, they waited. The silence was unbearable. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the horizon, waiting for Blackthorn to make his move. He knew it was only a matter of time before the fight would come to them. He just hoped they were ready for it. Then, through the haze of the setting sun, Jacob saw them, riders in the distance, moving toward them with purpose. Blackthorn's men were closing in. Jacob's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. "Now," Jacob muttered under his breath. "Now we fight." The riders appeared in the distance like shadows, their forms growing clearer with every passing moment as they approached. Jacob's heart rate quickened, his eyes narrowing as he watched them come. Blackthorn's men were making their move, just as he had anticipated. They had fallen for the trap, thinking they were moving in on a small, defenseless group of townsfolk. What they didn't know was that they were walking right into a fight they were ill-prepared for. The men of Larkspur were ready, huddled behind the natural barricades they had set up in the rocky outcroppings, using the terrain to mask their presence. Jacob knew they didn't have the luxury of a long battle. They had to make this quick. The element of surprise would only last for so long. Jacob's hand tightened around the reins of his horse as he signaled to Bill. "Wait for my signal. Let them get closer." Bill nodded, his face grim but determined, and Jacob could feel the tension building in the air. His plan had been simple. Draw Blackthorn's men in, make them think they had the upper hand, and then hit them when they were close enough to encircle. It was a risky move, but it was the only one that might work. As Blackthorn's riders drew nearer, Jacob's pulse thudded in his ears. He could see them now, their faces twisted in grim determination, their guns drawn and ready. They had come for blood. But what they didn't realize was that Jacob Cross and the people of Larkspur were ready to give them exactly what they were asking for. "Now!" Jacob shouted. The ground erupted with the sound of gunfire as the men of Larkspur rose from their positions, rifles and pistols aimed with deadly accuracy. The first few riders who had broken from the group fell instantly, their bodies crumpling to the ground as the shots rang out. Blackthorn's men didn't have time to react as they found themselves under fire from all sides. Jacob's revolver roared in his hand as he took aim at a rider coming directly for him. His shot rang true, and the man fell, his horse whinnying in panic as it careened to the side. Jacob didn't stop, his eyes scanning the battlefield as the chaos unfolded around him. "Push them back," Jacob shouted, his voice a steady command as he rode forward, urging his horse through the rocky terrain. "Keep them on the defensive." The men of Larkspur moved with precision, each shot aimed carefully as they cut down rider after rider. The shock of the ambush caught Blackthorn's men off guard, and they faltered, their formation breaking as they scrambled to regain control. They had expected to overwhelm the town, not to be struck first by a well-coordinated defense. Bill led a charge from the left flank, his horse galloping full speed as he took down another rider, knocking him off his horse with a well-placed shot. The riders around him followed suit, pushing the outlaws into a retreat as the men of Larkspur moved to block their escape routes. But Jacob knew this was only the first part of the battle. The drifters weren't finished yet. They might have been surprised, but Blackthorn was no fool. He would have a backup plan. They had to finish this quickly. From the corner of his eye, Jacob saw the dust rising on the horizon. More riders, coming fast, just as he had expected. Blackthorn was regrouping, bringing in reinforcements to outflank them. "Bill," Jacob shouted, his voice urgent. "We need to hold them here. Don't let them break through." Bill nodded, his face hardening as he rallied his men. "Hold the line," he called out. "Don't let them get past us." Jacob's heart raced as he turned his attention back to the battlefield. The fight was far from over. As the reinforcements poured in, Jacob and his men had to hold their ground against an enemy that was quickly regrouping. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise, and that might be all they needed. The gunfire was deafening, the crack of rifles and the roar of pistols filling the air as Jacob ducked behind a rocky outcrop to reload. His muscles were tense, his body aching from the hours of fighting, but he didn't let up. He couldn't afford to, not when so much was at stake. The battle raged on, with Blackthorn's men trying to break through the defensive lines. But Jacob and his men held fast, each volley of gunfire pushing the drifters back. Jacob's fingers ached as he pulled the trigger again and again. Each shot fired with precision, taking down another rider. And then, just as the tide seemed to be turning, Jacob saw him. Blackthorn himself, riding at the front of the reinforcements, his eyes burning with fury as he led his men forward. The outlaw leader's presence was unmistakable, his coat billowing in the wind as he charged toward the center of the battle, his revolver drawn and ready. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. Blackthorn was coming for him. He didn't hesitate. With a quick glance toward Bill, Jacob spurred his horse forward, charging directly toward Blackthorn, his revolver at the ready. The sounds of the battle seemed to fade away as Jacob's focus narrowed to just one thing: Blackthorn. The two men met in the middle of the battlefield, their horses rearing as they closed the distance. Blackthorn's eyes locked onto Jacob's, a wicked grin stretching across his face as he raised his revolver, aiming straight for Jacob's chest. But Jacob was faster. He drew his revolver with a swift motion, the crack of the shot ringing out in the silence between them. Blackthorn's eyes widened in shock as the bullet struck his hand, the revolver flying from his grasp and landing in the dirt. His horse reared in panic, throwing him to the ground with a thud. Jacob didn't wait for Blackthorn to recover. He dismounted swiftly, his revolver aimed directly at the outlaw leader's chest as Blackthorn struggled to rise. "It ends here, Blackthorn," Jacob said, his voice cold and steady. "You've lost." Blackthorn glared up at him, his teeth gritted in fury, but Jacob saw the defeat in his eyes. He had underestimated Larkspur, underestimated Jacob Cross, and now it was over. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying with it the sounds of distant cries, the echoes of gunfire, and the shifting of hooves. Jacob stood over Blackthorn, his revolver still aimed directly at the outlaw leader's chest. Blackthorn lay on the ground, his face twisted in pain, his hand gripping his bleeding wrist where Jacob's bullet had struck. His revolver was several feet away, his weapon useless, his body vulnerable. Jacob's eyes never left Blackthorn's face as he slowly stepped closer, keeping his revolver trained on the man who had terrorized the land for so long. This wasn't a moment of triumph. not in the way others might see it. No, this was the moment when a long chapter finally closed, when the West that had given birth to men like Blackthorn would finally be rid of him. Blackthorn grunted, trying to push himself up, but the pain in his hand and the shock of the bullet were too much. "You think this is over?" he spat, blood dripping from his lip as he glared up at Jacob. "You think you've won? You've only delayed the inevitable. There's always another gang, another outlaw. You can't kill us all, Cross." Jacob didn't flinch. "I don't need to kill you all," he replied, his voice quiet but filled with steel. "I just need to make sure you never hurt this town again." He motioned with his revolver, forcing Blackthorn to stay down. "You had your chance, Blackthorn. Now you'll face the consequences." But before Jacob could say another word, there was a shout from across the battlefield. One of Blackthorn's men, someone still loyal to the outlaw, had begun to fire on Jacob's men, desperate to break through the defensive lines. "Don't forget why we're here," Jacob muttered, his eyes narrowing as he turned to look at the chaos still unfolding around them. The battle was far from over, and Blackthorn's men, though weakened, were still trying to fight their way through. "Do you hear that?" Blackthorn sneered from the ground, his voice low and mocking. "They'll keep coming. You can't stop them all, Cross." Jacob glanced back down at the outlaw leader, his gaze hardening. "I don't need to stop all of them. I just need to stop you." With a final, swift movement, Jacob fired a single shot into the ground near Blackthorn, sending the message clear and loud. Blackthorn's men, seeing their leader defeated and vulnerable, began to hesitate. They knew this was the moment when they had to choose. Either they fought on in the name of a man who could no longer lead them, or they left the battlefield and survived. "Get out of here, Cross," Blackthorn shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. "You think they'll leave? You think they'll give up because I've fallen? There's more of us out there. More who'll keep coming. This town's as good as dead." Jacob ignored him, turning his back on the fallen leader. His mind raced. The moment of victory had come, but the fight wasn't over yet. The remaining drifters and outlaws would have to be dealt with, and quickly. The longer they stayed in the field, the more likely they would regroup and retaliate. "Bill," Jacob shouted across the battlefield, his voice sharp and commanding. Bill, who had been coordinating the defense on the other side of the town, rode over to Jacob with urgency in his eyes. "What's the plan, Jacob?" he asked, his voice still filled with the weariness of the long battle. "We've lost too many men. We can't keep fighting like this forever." Jacob's gaze flicked back to Blackthorn's men, who were starting to regroup, clearly trying to form a new line of defense. They hadn't been completely defeated, but they were disorganized and vulnerable. "We push them back. We hit them hard before they have time to reorganize," Jacob said quickly. "We force them into retreat and end this now, before they get a chance to regroup." Bill nodded without hesitation. "We can do that," he said firmly. "I'll round up the men and get them ready." Jacob paused for a moment, his eyes darting back to Blackthorn, who was still struggling to sit up, his glare full of venom. Jacob couldn't let the man live to fight another day. But he also knew that now was not the time for vengeance. The fight still raged, and the town of Larkspur needed him. "Take them in and make sure they know their positions." "I'll deal with this," Jacob said, his voice steady, despite the weight of the situation. Bill hesitated, looking at Jacob for a moment, but then nodded and rode off to rally the rest of the defenders. Jacob stood still for a moment longer, his revolver still drawn, his gaze still fixed on Blackthorn, who was now on his knees, his breathing labored from the pain. "You think you're safe just because you've got a little victory?" Blackthorn spat, his eyes full of hate. "You think you've won? There's always another fight, Cross. Always another man who's willing to take what you've got." Jacob didn't respond. He didn't need to. Blackthorn had spent his life threatening and terrorizing, but Jacob knew the truth now. Blackthorn's time was up. The fight was over for him. Jacob holstered his revolver and turned toward the battlefield once more. "It's over, Blackthorn," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "You've lost." He didn't look back as he rode to the center of the town, where Bill and the others were already moving to execute the final phase of their strategy. With Blackthorn's men in disarray, this was their chance to finish the fight. They had come this far, and they would see it through to the end. The sun had risen fully now, casting a golden light over the battlefield as the final shots rang out. The town of Larkspur, scarred and battered, had fought back. They had fought for their homes, their families, and for each other. The survivors of Blackthorn's crew began to retreat, their morale shattered by the defeat of their leader and the fierce resistance they had encountered. Larkspur had held. As the dust began to settle, Jacob surveyed the battlefield. The cost had been high, but Larkspur had survived. Jacob's eyes scanned the faces of his people, men and women who had fought side by side, their resolve unbroken despite the odds. They had won. They had taken a stand and made sure that no one would ever threaten their town again. "Let's rebuild," Jacob said quietly to himself, a slow smile creeping across his face. "Let's make sure they never forget who we are." The dust slowly began to settle over the town of Larkspur as the sounds of battle faded into the distance. The fight was over, and the town had won. Blackthorn's men had retreated, and the town was still standing, albeit scarred and battered. Jacob stood at the edge of the battlefield, his revolver still in hand, watching the aftermath. The battle had taken everything from them: wounds, loss, and fatigue. But it had also given them something more. It had given them a chance to rebuild, a chance to live free from the shadow of outlaws like Blackthorn. Jacob felt the weight of the moment. The victory was bittersweet. They had won, but it had come at a high cost. The men and women who had fought beside him, who had stood tall when their backs were against the wall, had given everything. Some of them were wounded, some of them were dead. And while the town had been saved for now, Jacob knew it would take time to heal the scars, both the physical and the emotional ones. Bill rode up to him, his face set in a grim expression. He had already seen to the wounded and the dead, but there was still work to be done. There was always work to be done in the West. "We did it, Jacob," Bill said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the battle. "We held them off." Jacob nodded, but didn't say anything at first. His mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had happened. Blackthorn was gone, but the West was still full of men like him, men who would stop at nothing to take what wasn't theirs. The fight wasn't truly over. "Not yet. We held them off," Jacob repeated softly, "but we can't let our guard down. We rebuild now. We make sure no one else ever threatens this town again." Bill gave a solemn nod. "We'll make sure of that, but it'll take time. The folks around here, they've seen what it's like to fight for survival. They know what's at stake." Jacob turned and looked at the town. Larkspur had been their home, their sanctuary, and now it would be a place where people could start anew. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. "Let's get to work," Jacob said, his voice firm. "The land's ours, and we'll defend it. But we also rebuild it. We make sure the people who died didn't die in vain. We owe them that." The days that followed were filled with both grief and determination. Jacob helped organize the survivors, dividing them into groups to tend to the wounded, bury the dead, and reinforce the town's defenses. But more than that, they worked together to rebuild their homes, to restore what Blackthorn's men had tried to take. It wasn't easy. There were days when it felt like the weight of everything was too much to bear, but Jacob was there, leading them. He was their rock, the one who had given them hope when everything seemed lost. Bill was a constant presence by his side, working tirelessly to ensure that the town stayed strong. Jacob could feel the bond between them deepening as they worked together to ensure that Larkspur remained free from the threat of Blackthorn and his men. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Jacob stood on the porch of his small cabin, looking out over the valley. The landscape had been scarred by battle, but it was still beautiful. The West had always been harsh, but it was also a place of great promise. The people of Larkspur had fought for that promise, and they had won. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the earth and the promise of a new day. Jacob breathed in deeply, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. The battle was over, and now it was time to rebuild. He turned as he heard footsteps behind him. Bill was standing there, his hat tipped slightly to the side, a faint smile on his face. "You're a hard man to kill, Jacob Cross," Bill said with a wry grin. "I think we've earned a little rest, don't you?" Jacob chuckled, the sound coming easier now. I think we've earned a lot more than that. But rest can wait. We've got work to do. The two men stood there in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the last light of the day casting long shadows over the land. You know, Bill said after a moment, his voice quieter, I've heard stories of men like you, outlaws, gunfighters, men who carve out their places in the world with blood and bullets. But I don't think anyone ever told the story of how one man, just a man, could change a whole town. You did that, Jacob. You gave them something to believe in. Jacob shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. I didn't do it alone, he said. Larkspur did it. We all did. And now we're going to make sure it stays that way. Bill nodded. You're right about that. The fight may be over for now, but this town's got a future, and it's brighter than it's ever been. Jacob smiled, feeling the weight of the past year lifting just a little, but he knew there was still more to do. The West was never truly done with a man like him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a place here. A place worth fighting for, worth defending. As the night deepened and the stars appeared above, Jacob turned back toward the town, ready for whatever the future held. He had fought for his home, and he had one. And now, he would build the future that Larkspur deserved. The West was harsh, but Jacob Cross knew that it could also be a place of hope, of redemption, and of survival. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would fight for it. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.